Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are connecting from, because we do have people connecting from London. I'd like to thank you all for honoring us today with your presence for this annual conference, Why is Housing So Unaffordable? Causes and Solutions. So before I set out to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Josh Ryan Collins, please allow me to share some information about the plan today. So after the keynote, we'll kick off with panel one that will shed some lights on the root causes of the housing problem. Then we'll take a lunch break at 12, come back at 2 p.m. to 4 p.m., panel two, that will examine the policies, local, state, and federal. We'll then observe a short coffee break, half an hour, and panel three will investigate alternative pathways to making housing affordable. Let me now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Joshua Ryan Collins. Dr. Collins is a professor of economics at UCL, University College London, since 2017. His research focuses on macroeconomic policy, housing and land, and sustainable finance. He is also a council member of the Progressive Economy Forum, a group of distinguished scholars advocating for better macroeconomic policy in the United Kingdom. Prior to this, Josh worked at NEF, the New Economics Foundation, as a senior economist and head of the finance program. He is also one of the founders of the Brixton Pound local currency. Josh has a PhD in finance and economics from the University of Southampton Business School, an MA in industrial relationship from Warwick University Business School, and a BA in sociology from Warwick. He authored two great books on the housing question, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing in 2017, Why Can't You Afford a Home?, which is, I think, very apropos for the theme of this conference. So I would suggest, if time would allow, to look into these two books as a summer reading recommendation if you are interested in the housing question. And I assume you are all interested in it. That's why you would be here today. So without any ado, let's allow our keynote speaker to take over. Josh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, and thanks to everyone for joining the session. You want me to keep to 25 minutes, is that right, Ibrahim? Or
that's fine, but we are flexible.
Okay, might go to half an hour, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to talk about demand side drivers of the housing crisis. My focus will be on high income economies such as the US, but I have to say I have much more experience of the European situation and the UK especially than the US. So my apologies from the beginning that it's the US. The varied US housing market is not my area of expertise. Nevertheless, I think much of the argument will apply to the US. As was mentioned, I'm a professor in economics and finance at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose based in London. Two of my books were already mentioned. I'm also going to be drawing on some academic papers that you can see there. A paper called Breaking the Housing Finance Cycle and another one more focused on the Australian housing market. Yeah, you can see the details of those papers. Both the papers are available to download online. I'm actually just going to take off my jumper because I'm quite hot. Excuse me a second. It's very cold outside here in the UK, about 16 degrees at the moment. A bit hotter in New York, I expect. So key kind of thing we're dealing with today is why are house prices so high relative to people's incomes. This is a simple chart showing the house price to income ratio it's the average of 16 advanced high income economies, including the US. And you can see that I've just plotted the long run average, which is the black line. So the actual house price to income ratio is indexed against that long run average. And what you can see there is kind of up to the 1990s, there's some evidence of a sort of equilibrium around the long run average, a bit of up and down movement, bit of volatility there. But something's happened in the 1990s. We have this huge rise in house prices with the leading up to the global financial crisis. We know that was much to do with a sort of credit-fueled boom in house prices. But what's interesting about this chart is that the house prices do not, relative to incomes, do not fall back to that sort of long-run average post the GFC. Rather, they come down a little bit, but then make their way upwards again from the sort of mid-2010s onwards. And since COVID, we've sort of seen what we saw in COVID, house prices going up even more. The outcome for this for home ownership, which of course is a key feature of Anglo-Saxon democracies like the US and the UK, the so-called home owning democracies, where the underlying philosophy is that if you work hard and play hard, work hard, work hard, raise a family, you'll get a home of your own, you'll have a stake in society, you'll see the value of your home appreciate, you'll be able to look after yourself when you're older and pass on your home to your kids, and they'll have a secure future. Well, that's all breaking down because we've seen this decline in home ownership. Interestingly, we've seen this decline more in the home owning democracies of these 6 Anglo-Saxon economies than we have in European economies. You can see there on average how home ownership was at its peak on average in these countries in the early 1990s probably, and in all countries, with Canada being an exception, and in all countries it's been either flatlining or falling really since then. And you can see in the US there, the orange line, it actually peaked a bit later in the early 2000s, but been falling since about 2003, 2004. The ratio of home ownership has fallen from about 68% at its peak in 2004-3, that looks like, to around below 65% today. And I think those figures are even worse. This probably only goes up to 2016 or 17, I think. So those figures have got even worse now in the US. So, fundamental political problem for these societies. Now, if your belief is that the cause of this problem is a lack of supply, i.e. there's just not enough homes being built for the demand from the population, then you think there's just not enough supply of housing space as a consumption good, in terms of the use value of the home, there's just not enough homes to supply to enable people to live where they want and to work where they want. You might have expected that rents would also have been shooting up very fast relative to incomes. But actually, if you compare the house price to income ratio and the house price to rent ratio, as I've done with this data also from the OECD, you can see here, again, this is averaged across about 16 advanced economies, that the house price to rent ratio has gone up even more than the house price to income ratio. In other words, house prices have been increasing at a much faster rate than rents, an even faster rate than rents than incomes. And actually rents have been broadly tracking incomes in most countries, more or less. Some exceptions in the big cities where rents have been increasing considerably faster than incomes. In particular in the last sort of 3 or 4 years with the COVID pandemic, actually, but some sort of funny things going on with the pandemic, such as more people working, more people choosing to work at home and wanting more space, and a lot of people but well, my argument is that really it's not about simply the supply of housing as a consumption good, but as an investment asset. And that's what happened during COVID, and I'll come on to that. But the broader argument really is that house prices are driven by the demand for location, and this is the factor that's not properly understood by economists, and this is reflected in the fact that when you break down the house price increase, it's land values that are mainly responsible for increases in house prices rather than the cost of the physical building. So this chart here shows land, house, and consumer prices. It's an index in the US since between 1975 and 2016. This is data from the Lincoln Institute. And you can see here the land price index in the yellow line is firstly much more volatile than the house price index or the consumer price index, which is used to measure inflation. But also the rise in house prices leading up to the financial crisis is much, much greater than that of house prices and relative to consumer prices. These dynamics are much more volatile. And there's a really nice paper by some German economists from 2017, which shows around 80% of house price increases between 1950 and 2012 can be explained by rises in land values. So the key argument is that land is fixed in its supply, as those of you who follow Henry George will know, so that means that housing supply is inherently inelastic, and of course the demand for housing, given the inelasticity of housing and land, actually grows over time as the rentier returns that are available increase. And this is, of course, what Henry George wrote about, and Adam Smith wrote about. The classicals all kind of agreed that this problem of land rent, the problem of the landlord capturing the increase in value of property derived from growth in the area where the land was situated rather than their own efforts, was a key problem for capitalism. So there's your quote from Adam Smith. But what's kind of interesting is that certainly in Europe, there has been a sort of rediscovery of this key argument in recent times, and I hope my own work has played some role in this process. But this is just a quote from the European Commission last paper they published, very interesting report they published last year on housing affordability. And you can see this quote here: the appropriation of economic rent by homeowners leads to suboptimal economic outcomes and raises affordability concerns. Measures to reduce the ability of homeowners to extract this rent could be part of a durable solution to house price inflation and housing affordability. And they also quoted my book, my 2017 book in that report, and invited me to come and give a talk to them on property tax reforms at the end of last year. So quite encouraging developments there in Europe in terms of understanding this relationship between rent extraction and housing affordability. And of course, rising land values and house price values are very bad news from an inequality perspective. It just means existing owners getting richer and able to borrow even more, and everyone else essentially getting poorer. And that is the problem that we face in the US and the UK and much of Europe today. The sort of orthodox position, neoclassical economics position, of course, essentially neglects this rent problem. This is a sort of subjective preferences theory of value. Prices determined in the free market. Private property rights are necessary for efficient free market exchange, but are sort of presented as natural, just emerging naturally as societies develop. And whilst land may have some short-run fixed costs, in the long run, it's really no different from capital or labor. And these three, land, capital, and labor, can can sort of be subsumed together into this vague concept of a fund of capital. This is the work of John Bates Clark. And of course, this marginalizes the role of ownership of the land and the rent that can be extracted from that ownership in this theory of marginal productivity, where income can simply be reduced to one's reward for contribution to production, and wealth are the savings due to one's productive investment effort. Of course, this theory is flawed. It doesn't help us understand what's been happening in land markets and housing markets. And the reason for that is that land and capital are completely different types of economic phenomenon. Land is finite in supply, as I've explained. Capital money is not. It's really only constrained by labor and energy. Land is fixed and immobile. Capital is highly mobile. Land appreciates in value with growth. Capital depreciates. Technological innovation and wear and tear. And as I said, ownership of land enables rent extraction. When it comes to man-made capital, rentier profits are somewhat constrained by competition, depreciation, and innovation. Of course, they're only constrained to the degree that there is regulation of them. And this is where obviously regulators and competition authorities have a very important role to play. But the key point, I suppose, is the fact that these two properties have sort of opposite qualities. They're attracted to each other. Credit and money seek out collateral that is that's going to rise in value over time, that can't be hidden away, that's not going to depreciate. And so banks like lending against land. They like lending against real estate. And so if you have a deregulated financial system, that is essentially what banks will do. They'll regulate against, they'll lend against real estate rather than other more productive forms of investment, whether that's lending to a small firm or a large firm, or for working capital, or for actual capital investment. So my key thesis, I suppose, in the books that were mentioned, is that the key driver of rising land and house prices has been this explosion in mortgage credit that we saw from the late 1980s onwards, particularly in the US and the UK. And you can see in this chart, which shows credit outstanding as a percentage of GDP on the left-hand axis, the orange line is business credit, non-mortgage credit, mainly business, and the blue is mortgage credit. You can see that in the late 1990s, you have this abnormal, or in the mid 1990s in the US and the UK especially, this enormous explosion in mortgage credit relative to other forms of lending. And that parallels with the rise in house prices, which is the dotted black line, which is shown on the right-hand axis. So for me, this is the key explanation, actually, for rising house prices. It's the deregulation of the mortgage markets, of the banking sector, coupled with this embrace of home ownership by high-income economies as a sort of political obligation that everyone should be provided with a home of their own, and these big subsidies we've given to homeowners relative to other forms of tenure. So just to reiterate, this is 60. I think this is 14 high income. The average of 14 high income economies. This data here, showing house prices and credit flows, and that's the period of mortgage market deregulation and innovation. The key financial innovation, of course, in this period was the creation of mortgage-backed securities, or in the US case, you've had mortgage-backed securities, obviously, for many, many years before the 1990s, but you had an explosion in mortgage-backed securities during that period. And in Europe, that's when this type of financial product really took off with the creation of the Eurozone. You suddenly had a much bigger market for mortgage-backed securities across the Eurozone. And of course, that these securities played a key role in the global financial crisis of 2008 because they got sort of increasingly complicated, and you had derivatives against them, and they got spread around the financial system. So nobody really knew where the risk was when the subprime crisis hit the US. Skip that one. So I've kind of explained this slide already, but what, to sum up, the thesis is that when you have a liberalized financial system, you get this positive feedback cycle between credit and land values. And you can kind of keep going, because if you have usually with a liberalized financial system, you can withdraw against the increasing value of your home via home equity withdrawal, and you can spend that on putting in a new kitchen, or, you know, paying for holidays, or for other consumption goods. And so you can sort of keep the economy ticking over, and you can have a sort of debt-led, consumer-led growth model. But this is not a very productive model, because the banking systems are not really supporting firm investment, like private investment. It's more supporting the purchase of existing homes, increasing competition for the purchase of existing homes, and home equity withdrawal supporting consumption rather than productive investment. The second block of this sort of financialization stroke rentierization of the housing market is the dominance of private landed home ownership as a form of tenure that, of course, enables anyone who owns land or owns a home to capture these land rents as prices rise up. Key aspects of this is the privatization of public housing that you've seen very much in much of Europe, and maybe the US to some extent as well. But I'm not, as I said, I'm not the expert on that. Liberalization of development policy. And the third plank of this is this property-oriented macroeconomic regime, which we've basically had in place, I would argue, since the mid-1990s, arguably, with very low interest rates or negative. I mean, we've had negative real interest rates since the global financial crisis in most cases. And this means that this makes it cheaper to borrow against property than otherwise would be the case. And you couple this with a very generous fiscal property regime with low taxes on property, and you get you get this huge incentive to put money into property for both the banking system but also for the wider investment community. And what you also get is a political alignment between the interests of middle and upper middle class households, the financial sector, and the real estate sector with politicians. And Australia, I sort of see as a kind of ideal type example of this. This is the sort of, in some ways, the most financialized or rentierized of all of the Anglo-Saxon economies. At least in the US, you've got a bit more diversity in terms of things like property tax. You have certain states that really do have quite high property taxes. For example, the famous example of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, the split rate tax, for example. But generally, you have actually higher tax rates than much of Europe, and you have a sort of more diverse banking system across the continent. Australia just basically has 5 banks. They're all doing mortgage lending, and it's got an incredibly generous fiscal policy regime, tax regime for homeowners. Anyway, I've tried to sort of summarize this argument in this rather complicated chart. What I'm trying to capture here is the sort of pro-cyclical nature of this sort of political economy of housing and finance. And so at the center of it is, of course, this rising house prices and private land rent capture, leading to increased speculative demand for residential property, demand for housing as a financial asset, leading to even more financial flows going into housing and more household debt, leading to even further rising house prices. Just to be clear, most new mortgage credit is for the purchase of existing property, not for building new homes. If a mortgage is for building a new home, that's a different matter, because you are creating it's more of a productive investment. You're going to be building stuff. You're going to have supply chains of small businesses supporting the building of the property, and you can sort of absorb that credit into the economy without it being inflationary. Not the case if you'll just basically have different people competing to push up the price of land by getting the highest mortgage. And I've already talked through the role of financial deregulation and innovation, and the role of residential mortgage-backed securities and real estate investment trusts. Key point there is the role of institutional investors. And then you couple that with this very tax-friendly property wealth regime and government subsidies aimed squarely at the demand for housing rather than the supply of housing, and in a weakening non-market housing offer. And so you're going to get this rapid build-up in house prices with this type of system. Land values, like all other assets, are inversely related to the real interest rate. And so if you have falling real interest rates, you're going to have rising land values, because property investment just becomes relatively more attractive to investors, as it's a very good substitute for government bonds and other safe assets. And what you've seen since the global financial crisis is this sort of what is known in the literature as housing financialization 2.0. So the first phase of financialization was this deregulation of the mortgage banking sector, of regulated banks, deposit-taking banks, leading to this explosion in credit, which I've talked about. But the second phase, post the GFC, when there was sort of macro-prudential policy, which somewhat restricted lending by banks, is you saw institutional investors, pension funds and insurance companies increasingly getting into real estate investment, often through intermediaries like real estate investment trusts and real estate funds and private equity and hedge funds, which typically would act as an intermediary, taking money from the institutional investors and then putting it into property. And of course, in the US, you've had firms like Blackstone playing a very important role in the build to rent sector, for example, and typically buying up property in poorer areas of the country, or property that where there was very low prices post financial crisis and very little demand, and essentially doing up these properties or building new properties and pushing up the rents, and sort of gentrifying these areas and essentially filling the rent gap, as it were, and making a lot of money out of it, usually selling on the properties once they'd done that with huge capital gains. And I'd really recommend Brett Christopher's work on this if any of you are interested in this phenomenon. He's done some really nice research in the US on the role of Blackstone and these sorts of companies. And of course, the very low interest rates just work very well for the business model of these firms, because what they do is they leverage their existing land real estate stocks to borrow very, very cheaply to buy more, or use the money to do up the existing stock and buy more land, and thus continuing this housing finance cycle that I've talked about. And of course, states have generally just supported this process. We've seen very generous tax breaks for real estate investors in cities in particular. We've seen the privatization of public housing programs, particular in Europe, in cities like Dublin and Berlin. We've seen this. You've seen the deregulation of rental markets, which is often a requirement of these types of companies, because they want to extract maximal rents. They don't want sort of, capping of rents, rent caps, which is increasingly coming back in popularity actually in Europe as rents really soar. And you've typically seen rising housing benefits for the private rental sector as rents have gone up but incomes have stagnated. The state has had to step in and basically end up subsidizing these companies by paying tenants more and more of their rent so that they can stay afloat. And this this process of more and more investment flows going into sort of these so-called global cities you can see all around the world, including in US cities like San Francisco and Manhattan, and I'm sure it's happening in other places, probably like Florida, I expect, is another example of this. But also in many other cities across the world. And what's interesting is you see this synchronization of real estate values in these cities. They sort of synchronize with each other away from the hinterland of these cities. So the smaller towns and cities in the same country don't see anywhere near like this kind of takeoff in house prices. And that's because institutional investors, global institutional investors, are zooming in on these cities where real estate is seen as a very safe investment. It's essentially become a sort of new gold for these investors in a regime which we've had up until 2 years ago of very, very low interest rates. And this chart just shows you the value of corporate buy to let or buy to rent investment in Europe. These are all investments of more than 5 million euros. Euros about the same as the dollar, more or less, from 2007 to 2020. This huge explosion in these massive deals. And this is where there were more than 10 apartments acquired. Now, the powers that be, the G20, have encouraged this process of securitization with multilateral development banks encouraged to get into this business. MDB should collaborate to enable system-wide securitization to mobilize institutional investors. Securitizing on a large scale will create new asset classes and attract a wider range of investors. So there's the policymakers have viewed this huge explosion in institutional real investment as a universally good thing, even though there's lots of evidence that it's just pushed up house prices well beyond what ordinary people can afford in cities, especially. I won't go through this because this is a bit more relevant to the UK. This is just tax reliefs and beneficial interventions in the property tax market in the UK, but the US, you've essentially seen a similar pattern. Most of it happened, I think, in the post-war period more. But this chart just shows the decline in property taxes. That's the local percentage of local taxes in blue at the top, percentage of own source general revenue in orange, and total general revenue in grey. Of course, you had the emergence of income tax in the Second World War, and that and you also had VAT, and there was a lot of taxes on car energy, on petrol. So all of these started to become more important, and property tax was just sort of allowed to just become a lower and lower proportion of tax revenue, which of course has contributed to these issues that we have today. So I'm going to just don't want to take up too much more of your time. Just want to be a bit more positive, sort of say it doesn't have to be this way. There are places where things are different. And this chart just shows you the Anglo-Saxon average of the house price to income ratio, which I showed you already, is the red dotted line. But you can see there are countries where this hasn't happened. We haven't had this enormous explosion in house prices. And Germany and Korea are two examples of that. More recently in Germany, we have seen rapid house price increases in cities, especially Berlin and Munich. But for most of that period, you didn't see this. So the interesting question is, why was this? And what reforms can we institute to get us out of this problem? And my work has been mainly focused on the role that central banks could take, and more broadly, what you might call financial policy. And I would argue central banks need to be much more focused on asset prices, not just consumer prices. It really doesn't make sense to have interest rates very, very low just because consumer price inflation is so low when you've got house prices shooting through the roof. And that's what they did. That's what they've done basically since 2008, and in the lead up to the financial crisis as well. I would argue there should have been more attention to house prices. quantitative easing, as I've said, has also contributed to the problem, pushed down interest rates on safe assets. You're going to incentivize lending to real estate. So, credit guidance is another option. Credit guidance was used very widely in high-income economies in the post-war period, where you actually suppressed credit for household purchase and consumer credit, and encouraged credit to flow into strategic sectors of the economy. Typically, it was high value added manufacturing and export sectors in the US and Europe in the post-war period. Today, it would obviously be funding for green energy infrastructure and the green transition, as Joe Biden's doing to some extent with the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. But you could get the central bank supporting that with these credit guidance type tools. And this would go much further than the macroprudential policy and that we've seen, which I don't think has gone far enough. But there are other options. You can also have state-owned banks, which are focused on directing finance to the right parts of the economy and don't require small businesses to put up their house as collateral every time they want a loan, that can sort of decouple the banking system from this housing finance cycle. And a nice example of this is the French Banque Centrale du Crédit Mobilier et Industriel, which basically helped build railroads right across the European continent in the 19th century. And what's interesting about this is the name, the Bank of Mobile Credit and Industry, rather than the Crédit Immobilier, which is what we have today. It's immobile credit. Banks create money to buy immobile existing assets, houses essentially, rather than industry and mobile assets like trains. The KfW is the major German state-owned bank, and this has played a huge role in supporting the German green transition. Has invested in solar panels on roofs, has invested in the green energy infrastructure in Germany in a way that it's about 20% of GDP. The KfW is a massive state bank, and of course they don't give anyone loans to just buy existing houses. The other option, of course, is a more Georgist approach of trying to capture land values, whether that's through taxes on infrastructure investment, which I'm sure you will all be familiar with. This is the model that's used in Hong Kong very successfully, or taxation, which is the other sort of most hotly debated topic. But of course, you can also just simply make sure the land is owned by the government, by the public sector, and then you lease out property for different uses, which is the sort of Singapore model. And in fact, there's a whole range of planning tools that can be used to sort of capture land value increases, and this is some of those in a recent OECD report. So there's lots of interest in these tools. I think the challenge is sort of the political will to sort of do it. And this is your favorite man, I assume, a picture of him talking about land value tax here. I think the way to do LVT today is you've got to make it tax neutral somehow. You've got to reduce income tax or corporation tax to get business on side. You've got to find ways of allowing delayed payment for example, older people who are income poor but asset rich, or some sort of equity release schemes. And maybe you've got to talk about hypothecating the profits from LVT to citizens' income or some other popular type of scheme. The great example of this is the Norwegian Oil Fund, where the profits from this are distributed across the nation. And I think I'll leave it there because I've talked for half an hour. But this is the Singaporean model, where 90% of land is owned by the state, and South Korea has a similar sort of very powerful land corporation. And then there's community land trusts as well on a smaller scale. And just to finish, I suppose, in Barcelona at the moment, there's some very interesting developments. The mayor of Barcelona, Ada Colau, is doing some fantastic things, playing a much more, getting the local the government to play a much more proactive role in both building affordable homes, but also buying. They've introduced a new law where the local government has the first right of refusal on any private rented accommodation where the owner is selling the property. The state can come in and buy the property and turn it into affordable housing. So they're actually, as well as building new homes, they're purchasing homes from the private rental market and turning them into affordable homes. So it's a sort of 10-year shift strategy that's being undertaken there. And they're also building some really fantastic ecologically sound homes as well. So I'll just finish with a summary. Land and housing have unique economic properties, as we know. If you have a deregulated land market, it will tend towards monopoly, rent extraction, and inequality. And if you couple that with a deregulated financial sector, you'll make it even worse because of this important relationship between finance and land. So the duty really is on policymakers to shape both of these markets and socialize these land rents to provide affordable housing, and a range of land value capture tools are available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Collins. I'm gonna now allow Ed Dodson to step in for kicking off panel number 1.
Okay, thank you, Ibrahima. Well, Josh did us a great favor of providing us with an excellent survey of the state of the residential property markets. And that is a term I prefer to use rather than housing markets, because we're talking about land and buildings, of course. So the residential property markets have gotten to the state they're in over a long period of time by all of the means that Josh has provided to us. So in this panel discussion, we're going to discuss the root causes of the housing problem. And we have 3 excellent presenters. And then Josh will join us after those 3 presentations, and I will lead a discussion posing questions to all 4 of them. And then we'll have an exchange, after which the members of our audience will be brought in to ask questions. So we have to hope to have a vigorous discussion, and we have about an hour and a half to do that. The first presenter in this panel will be New York City Comptroller Brad Landler. I'm not going to read all the biographies of everyone, but he has a background in community organizing and urban planning. And so I'm sure his comments are going to be important for us to listen to. Brad will be followed by Angela Lee Stovall, who is a research and policy manager at justfix.nyc. She's very much focused in her work on defense of tenants and tenants' rights. She co-authored a research paper on the corporatization of New York real estate. And then last in the list of presenters will be Mark Mollineaux, who is someone with an engineering background who became interested in the principles of Henry George and how they relate to the housing issues and the residential property issues in the country. He hosts a podcast on Henry George's principles and ideas at Stanford University's KZSU station. And with that, I would welcome Brad Landler to join us and give us his comments on what are the root causes of the housing problem.
Ed, I just got information that Brad is going to be on CNN. So he's going to come join us with some delay. So he asked.
Okay. All right. Well, Angela, I hope you're with us, and I hope you're prepared to step in and take over in the number 1 slot for us this morning.
I don't know about that, but I'm very pleased to be here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel really fortunate to have the opportunity to speak with you at this conference. My name is Lee Stovall, and I'm the housing specialist at JustFix, focusing mainly on research and policy. Prior to joining JustFix, I was the intervention manager for the Source of Income Discrimination Unit at the New York City Commission on Human Rights, so mostly focusing on combating housing discrimination based on receipt of housing subsidies and vouchers. And I've also worked in eviction defense in the tenants' rights unit at New York Legal Assistance Group. This presentation will focus on a report I co-wrote with my former colleague, Sam Rabia, who's now a journalist at the city, concerning the corporatization of New York City housing stock. So first, just to give a background, some context of JustFix as an organization. So JustFix is a housing nonprofit that co-creates tech tools in support of the housing movement. So while we believe technology has the potential to strengthen and support existing work within the tenants' rights movement, we do not believe that technology is the solution. So we center our work on the advocate and user experience, and it's grounded in the belief that housing is a human right. So our approach to research and policy explores the systems and structures that impede access to equitable and livable housing. JustFix believes data transparency proves to be a powerful tool affecting change. So in collaboration with our partners, we use data to support organizers and build support for the tenants' rights campaigns. Some of our tools include Who Owns What, which allows users to search any building or landlord name in the city of New York and obtain information concerning who owns the building, changes in number of rent-stabilized units, complaints and violations in a building, how many buildings are within the owner's portfolio, all by aggregating public source data. It's an excellent resource for research, for organizing, and for piercing the corporate veil. Another tool is a letter of complaint that generates a free letter that is sent to your landlord via certified mail with data obtained through Who Owns What, with a request for repairs, with the intention of improving housing conditions in users' apartments. And one last tool that I want to just share with you all is our rent history bot, where users can request their rent histories online and via text. Our report was essentially inspired by a previous report written by Sam Rabia on the myth of the mom and pop landlord in New York. We wanted to delve deeply into the number of large landlords that were in fact corporation. So this initial report explored building registrations from the Housing Preservation Development, or HPD, across the city, using Who Owns What to get a sense of networks of buildings within an owner's portfolio. So oftentimes when we're talking about pro-tenant legislation, a common narrative that you will hear is that, we can't pass more robust tenants' rights because, of the small mom and pop, we have to protect them. So we wanted to kind of get a sense of how many there are actually in the city. So through Sam's research, he found that the typical owner in New York has an average of 21 properties with 893 units. There was also some additional analysis of the rates of evictions with large property owners and the type of units that they actually control. So a report found that landlords with 20 or more buildings accounted for more than half of all evictions in the city, and that large landlords control a majority of rent-stabilized apartments. Along with applying for the most major capital improvements, or MCIs, which was often used as a strategy for obtaining increases building wide for rent stabilized apartments. Housing Justice for All calls MCIs one of the several tactics that landlords exploit to raise rents and drive displacement, because landlords can kind of pass off the cost of larger changes into the apartment onto the tenants. And what made this report really critical was that it countered a narrative that often pushed by large landlords that NYC is still a city of small landlords and that pro-tenant legislation unfairly harms the little guy. This report opposed that narrative and actually made those numbers a bit more cogent. And here is just a visualization of the map of the average citywide portfolio size for each neighborhood in New York City with buildings registered with HPD. Small family homes that are owner occupied do not have to be registered with HPD, so that's not taken into account in this report. But you can see from this map, basically the entire island of Manhattan is owned by large landlords of 30 to 60 plus buildings. Okay, so for as an introduction for this study, this report explored the shift towards corporate ownership during a 20-year period. So for our methodology, we first assessed a random sampling of 1,000 deeds across the city using NYC's data portal and ACRIS. We then picked out keywords that would indicate corporate versus individual ownership. So for example, corp, LLC, trust. Once we confirmed this method was sound from some peer review, we applied this to the entire database of NYC deed transfers from 2003 to 2022. And then for the entire database of deed transfers, we compared the number of properties that corporations bought with properties individuals purchased. It's not uncommon for individual building owners to form their own LLC. And it's usually as a means to sort of insulate themselves from personal liability. So we excluded those transfers. So we eliminated any transfer that didn't actually represent a sale. So we removed any deed that had a nominal sale price listed. So you'll see that on the deed that it's only like $0, that sort of thing. So we eliminated those. We also limited our analysis to the boroughs of Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx because ACRIS does not hold financial records for the borough of Staten Island, as noted on their website, at least at this time. So the data revealed a major shift following, 2008, the Great Recession. While individuals were the predominant buyer of property for most of the 2000s, corporate acquisitions overtook individual purchases in 2011 and remain the dominant type of transaction to this day. The data also, includes corporation, when a corporation sold to another corporation or when an individual sold to another individual. But we also wanted to more clearly track when properties became corporatized. So we analyzed trends in property acquisitions, specifically where the owner type switched. So when an owner sold to a corporation and vice versa. So here is an initial visualization that was included in the report. So while 76% of New York City households are situated in large multifamily buildings with 3 or more units, small family homes with less than 3 units make up about the remaining 24% of households. In fact, small family homes represent 78% of residential buildings in the city, according to the New York City Department of City Planning. But prior to 2008, individuals rather than corporations purchased more 1 to 2 unit residential homes, but immediately following the period of the Great Recession around 2008, corporations started outpacing individual purchasers and began dominating the market for small family homes. And between 2011 and 2016, the rate at which 1 to 2 unit buildings became corporatized nearly doubled. So moreover, the vast majority of rent stabilized apartments are located in large buildings. Basically, the legal framework for rent stabilizations, for those that are unfamiliar, it's essentially like when you think about how it's characterized kind of in the broader sense, is it's an older building with 6 or more units. There are some other exceptions with 421A and J51 tax exemptions that would include, newer buildings, but essentially anything that's built up until 1971 and they're larger buildings. But for rent stabilized properties, like with smaller housing types, corporations demonstrated their greatest purchasing power around 2014. So the green line represents individual ownership, pink line is corporate ownership. So I'll discuss a little bit about some of the sociopolitical touch points to hone in the trajectory of what we're seeing in this graph. So sort of facing the repercussions of predatory home lending schemes, the United States fell into a period of an economic crisis in 2008. So while housing valuations rose consistently, by 2005, the housing bubble was beginning to burst and prices plummeted to unprecedented lows. Many American homeowners were exploited by piggyback loans and subprime mortgages, and there was a lot of experiences of foreclosure at unparalleled rates. And although there was some reform for the metrics used for loan approvals, with mortgage lenders accepting only applicants that were likely to pay those loans back. In 2008, New York City lost around over 13,000 family homes, which family homes in this is defined as 1 to 4 unit homes due to foreclosure, which impacted over 31,000 households throughout the crisis. So when a rental property is foreclosed upon, tenants residing there will often face eviction proceedings in housing court, If they're not immediately brought to court, they may also just experience property neglect issues just because they don't know who to contact. There isn't anyone taking care of the property. Or once the property is actually sold, constructive evictions, which are essentially when there are like repairs or renovations being made that make it so unlivable that, you know, people are kind of forced to leave on their own accord. So even within the city of renters, there's a deep impact from this time. And then also just like locally, this is under Michael Bloomberg's administration from 2002 to 2013. So, you know, the legacy of the Bloomberg era in housing is, you know, very much characterized by a ballooning number of people living in homeless shelters, the proliferation of 80-20 buildings to address the affordable housing crisis. So again, the 80-20 buildings are essentially where there's like mixed income, where it's 80% pay market rate and 20% are subsidized in exchange for, you know, the developer's ability to kind of skirt certain zoning restrictions, things of that nature. One of Bloomberg's also kind of one of his political priorities was to prioritize rezoning practices that incentivize the growth of commercial businesses. So we see like a big transformation in Williamsburg and Hudson Yards. You know, Bloomberg's overall conservatism, especially with housing, was bolstered by, you know, New York State also, with the Rent Guidelines Board setting rent increases that encourage tactics of deregulation based on high income, high rent, massive increases for individual apartment improvements for units, and then major capital improvements, MCIs, for building-wide changes. And the primary goal for landlords was to evict long-term tenants in favor of gentrifiers to deregulate their housing stock and obtain the 20% vacancy bonus to maximize their profits. And that fueled massive displacement and rapid gentrification. You know, going into Bill de Blasio's administration, which some have credited for more pro-tenant policies, and there have been some historic victories. You know, de Blasio has been credited with right to counsel within housing court, which provides legal representation for low-income New Yorkers facing eviction and risk of homelessness. But this was really a testament to the incredible work of organizers and tenant advocates that began in the Bronx. You know, de Blasio also kind of has been credited with housing voucher reform and increases in the city FEP subsidy. But again, that was a lot of advocacy from people on the ground. But the big thing that happened in 2019 is the Housing Stability Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we're going to refer to as the HSTPA. So that created some of the most robust protections for both rent stabilized and market rate tenants. It eliminated the vacancy bonuses. It prevented landlords from revoking preferential rent, so that's with the lifetime of the tenancy and not just the lease term, and prohibited the use of the tenant blacklist, which really prevented a lot of people who had experiences with eviction in the past from obtaining housing. So even people that like had vouchers that, you know, had were able to rent other apartments were sometimes turned away illegally because of the tenant blacklist, among other historic reforms. You don't have to get into like all of the HSTPA, but this was huge. And this was, you know, like I said, had advocates and organizers really were constantly engaged in the struggle for tenants' rights. And there was a progressive New York State Assembly that kind of heeded that call. But corporations are still the dominant owner type, even with this, and likely due to the tumult caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, building acquisitions went down overall. So it's really difficult to evaluate the effect of HSTPA, if they have any, on the real estate market. But we were also interested in looking at what smaller buildings, what happened with smaller buildings, especially because the HSTPA would hamper landlords from employing the same strategies for rent increases through deregulation. So it might, and we were curious to see if it would incentivize purchases of smaller homes that are not subject to regulation, where they can kind of set their own rents at market value. So a lot of the next slides are going to be centered on smaller buildings. So while 76% of New York City households are situated in large multifamily buildings with 3 or more units, small family homes with less than 3 units, like I said, make up about 24% of households. So the vast majority of rent stabilized apartments the vast majority of rent stabilized apartments are located in larger buildings, like I said before, for rent stabilized properties, like with the smaller housing types, corporations are still demonstrated as the highest. The corporations, along with the smaller buildings, corporations are the leading buyers. So here we're looking at 1 to 2 unit buildings, from corporation to person, person to corporation, 3 to 5 unit buildings, and also rent stabilized units. 1 second, my computer's freezing a little bit. Okay, and then this one, how often do buildings change ownership type? So in 2005, they were essentially equal, and then it flips in 2014 with corporations buying nearly 4 times as many properties as individuals. I think part of the novelty of this project is that we may be able to intuit that corporations backed by major purchasing power would be the predominant owner type for larger buildings. And also just like in terms of our own lived experience as New Yorkers and thinking about like who owns your building, do you interface with a large a managing company, et cetera. But I think one of the more interesting facts is that like it wasn't always the case, and that there has been a fundamental shift within the market and it became corporatized more over time. Again, while maybe it's to comprehend that the larger buildings in New York are owned by corporations, we want to explore what has happened to ownership in buildings with fewer units. So this graphic really illustrates the shift towards corporate ownership in almost every single zip code across the city. And as with gentrification generally, patterns of corporatization have not necessarily occurred evenly, but neighborhood by neighborhood, changes that the changes within those neighborhoods echo larger trends in real estate speculation and have likely been exacerbated by pro-development policy shifts in the post-recession era. So in 2003, individuals represented the predominant type of multifamily property buyer in almost all neighborhoods in New York City, with the only exception being lower and upper Manhattan and a few areas in the outer borough. But by 2010, the dynamic flipped and corporations became the predominant buyer. That was especially true in rapidly gentrifying areas. So these neighborhoods include East and South Bronx, which some have referred to in many different publications as the real estate frontier or SoBro, how they try to market different neighborhoods with different names, as well as central Brooklyn neighborhoods that the Urban Displacement Project identifies as epicenters of gentrification. So we're talking about Williamsburg, Crown Heights, and Bed-Stuy. Transit hubs often triggered corporate speculation as well. So I've often, when I worked in Queens, there was a lot of discussion about how Jamaica could be the next center for gentrification because of the transit options like the Long Island Railroad, the F, the J, the E, just the ability to get to JFK. There's also been a lot of discussion about potentially more gentrification occurring in East New York because of Broadway Junction. And politicians like Charles Barron have made a major part of their platform centering the protection of the affordable housing stock in those areas. Lastly, I think there's maybe 2 more slides, but we wanted to also kind of ground some of our understanding of corporatization and evictions during COVID. So this graphic felt incredibly stark to us, and we took a map from the corporate buying from 2013 to 2018, and then the number of evictions by zip code during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's looks very similar. It looks almost like the same map. And it's, a devastating, unprecedented time of global pandemic exacerbated by housing loss. And it showcases corporations' ability to very easily navigate the court system. And we'll kind of go into the consequences of what happens once a building is corporatized. So here is just another map of kind of what it looked year by year for individuals versus corporations in terms of ownership. And one of the biggest things is it just changes the cultural fabric of the building itself. So how tenants are able to request repairs, how they're able to pay rent, how they renew their lease, it may all become automated and rely entirely on online systems. So like that caters to a very specific, market and a very specific tenant type. You know, if you're used to talking to your super in the building, there's, you know, and now you have to make a request for repairs online, like that is definitely limiting in terms of like people who do not have access or ability. There's also like language access questions. But you know, tenants also have the right to, you know, pay rent however they choose, but owners often obfuscate those rights. So they might say that it has to be through the online portal, things of that nature. But yeah, these systems cater to the needs and ease of those tenants that will generate the most profit, so mostly gentrifiers. Corporations also mechanize evictions and evict tenants at a higher rate than individuals. So they often make use of in-house counsel, or, you know, have a specific law firm that they use all the time, where they kind of can churn out these boilerplate petitions or send automated rent demand notices once, you know, that is triggered by a tenant's failure to pay on a specific date. And that can make tenants feel incredibly harassed and precarious in their housing overall. And I think it's really important to look at all of this holistically in terms of like affordability as a crisis in this city as well. You know, landlords are often talking about the issue of housing as an issue of scarcity, that there simply isn't enough housing available overall. Meanwhile, there are tens of thousands of vacant units currently. And the HSTPA may stem the tide of rapid deregulation of affordable housing, but new policy solutions to address the affordability crisis continue to entrench a system where housing is first and foremost a means of profit. And as our data analysis shows, corporate speculation of residential properties correlates with displacement. So new policy initiatives can more effectively curb displacement in the long term if they regulate who actually gets to own property and for what purpose, in addition to addressing the harm caused by corporate greed. So I think there needs to be, you know, a more radical look at examples outside of the US. You know, there has been a coalition of folks in New York that have gone to Vienna to look into social housing, and you know, something more radical that gets at the root is probably necessary and needed. And it's a very interesting time within the housing movement generally. There's been a lot of harnessing of tenant power with collective action, engagement with the struggle for tenant power generally, and especially under the current administration with Eric Adams, where there has been such a hostility against the tenant movement with the violent policy against the unhoused, rejection of housing voucher reform, and advocacy for increase on rent stabilized housing. There, you know, on the state level, the fact that like there wasn't not enough energy and, you know, political will to pass good cause, which would have given added protection for tenants who are not in rent stabilized housing and create caps for rent increases. And those, you know, protections are very necessary, but they're in a lot of the dialogue and in the discussion about implementing this policy. A lot of carve-outs were discussed from the original policy to make it that, you know, landlords who only owned, you know, small buildings or a certain number of units would be exempt from these rent increases, again, with the idea of like protecting the smaller landlord. So I think, you know, looking at the actual data and kind of problematizing and dismantling that argument is really necessary, because this rhetoric to justify these actions are often tied to the idea of protecting those interests of small landlords who cannot keep up with the costs of operating and ultimately performing their obligations that they have as landlords under the law. So I think it's important to analyze the veracity of these claims and counter these narratives, because the actual lived consequences of these choices deeply impact tenants and often the most marginalized among us. I will end it there. If there's any questions or comments, if you want to like reach out to me after this, if you have any questions about JustFix generally, you can email hello at. If you have questions about our tools, you can email support at. And then if you have any questions about my work or the report, you can, that's my personal email as well. So I'll end it there.
Well, Angela, thank you so much for that presentation. That was quite enlightening. For someone like me who spent my entire life in mortgage finance and the investment community, there's some interesting revelations based on your research and data that I'm sure will generate some questions when we get to that stage of this panel. So thank you again. Mark Mollineaux will now tell us a little bit about, you know, his investigations and how he came to find that the principles of Henry George provide some insight into why it is that housing prices have become so unaffordable. Mark, please join us.
So yeah, this is just a few thoughts of exactly, what I believe are the broad strokes in, what's what's screwed up now. How do we get here? Where are we going to go? There's a lot of different, I think, timescales we can look at to say things used to not be this bad, and now they are bad. And I think a lot of different timescales can be useful. I think the most natural ones tend to be within our own lifespans. I think especially we have I think idealizing, the kind of Great Society era, the strong unions, the white picket fences that are affordable of the 50s, 60s, etc. But I think it's useful to look at that. But I honestly think we need to look a bit further. And here are a few slides showing diagrams from a city I'm very familiar with, Cincinnati, Ohio. There's a lot of good histories of it. I think it's a kind of useful kind of stand-in for a lot of different cities. But this is going back to 1890. And for a lot of cities, this is from a book by historian Zane Miller called Boss Cox's Cincinnati, which came out, I think, in the late 60s, mid 60s. But he has a kind of framework for, how cities function in multiple areas. He has the circle, the zone, and the hilltops. The circle is, what people might call the kind of, pre-transportation city, the walking city. In Cincinnati, it is the flat area where people could stop. It was, it was a chaotic, crazy place. It was almost fully integrated, but there were race wars. I think I think you wouldn't want to romanticize such a place, full of disease, full of violence. But it was how people lived. If you're going to a place, you would end up in the circle if you were just just some normal person. And the hilltops are basically the well-to-do folks who are trying to escape from it. In Cincinnati, there is an actual, basin and hilltop zone. In fact, you see hilltops surrounding all sides of it. You see Price Hill, you see Clifton, that's Mount Adams there on the right. These were places people escaped to. The zone is the kind of middle-class boundary area between the two. So one thing he looks at is how this advanced in time. You see 1890, it was not that hard. If you had horse and carriage, you could be well-to-do and the time and servants to help you just get away from it all up to the hilltops. But the fact that the middle class were encroaching, made them escape further. So by 1910, you can see the middle class is moving up. What is actually a small creek valley is moving up into some of the hilltops, and you see the suburbanites move further and further out. The great working masses continue to be in the circle. The reason I bring this up, I mean, if you talk about the insights of Henry George and so on, I think the law of rent is very, very useful to saying, what can people afford? And usually it is, what are your alternatives? What can you, where can you go? And basically, I think if you look at the pressure cooker, if you only have the circle, people are stuck. You can build denser and denser slums, and they did. I mean, tenements in Cincinnati, like most cities, were legion. But the fact that there was a middle class escape route, the zone was really the way that allowed some sort of daylight out. I mean, most people didn't escape, but they at least had the hope of escaping. But let's continue on and on of how this went. So I'm going to shrink this down just a bit for the reason of here is the 20th century in a nutshell. So that is Cincinnati in the last, basically where is built. This is, a person who looked at all data of construction. And this is, even, I mean, what's sad about this, you can go up, a good half hour in every direction and continue to see a lot of really, miserable post-war suburbs full of full of awful people. But in general, the actual built environment or so on, more or less stagnated, stayed the same. in the kind of classic city. But we had a program. The program was we will help you, with the home ownership program. The home ownership program, if you move out to where there is free land, you can, get your own place. It will be built relatively cheaply, and you can, continue to work usually in the center city. Increasingly there'll be suburban office places as well. What's interesting here is, at this moment, to get to, the outer reaches of the suburban commute shed, you're talking, half hour, an hour, and Cincinnati's not as bad as most. And that's a reason why it's relatively affordable. But this is all basically built out, at least in the way it is building. You could always do infill, but we never do. So as far as it goes, we're seeing a kind of, an end of the line as far as this program. I mean, we're actually in Cincinnati. If you go north enough, you hit Dayton, so you got two blobs hitting each other. And the other part of this is just the fact that this program of suburbanization and fleeing the city, was pursued in conjunction with, active, I would say, busybodyism of the racist sort. At the same time, Cincinnati went into its, what you would call slums, or you call tenements, but it is where its Black community live, the West End, and bulldozed it for highways. That is, it's one of the more egregious, but this happened time and time again in many cities. Communities are displaced, moved into where they could find, and there is, again, conflict, race wars, segregation pursued by realtors, et cetera, et cetera. The center city, what was left of it, largely abandoned. This was the mid-century white flight. And now you're seeing that reverse. You're seeing, well-to-do white yuppies, young hipsters, et cetera, move back, and displacement, pursuing. I think it's very easy to say things used to be nice in the center city, or things used to be affordable in the center city, and we're now seeing an aberration. I see the mid-century, bottoming out of the center city as being the aberration. I think in the large sense of the law of rent, the core of the city is always going to be where people, there's always going to be a ton of people who are aiming at that. And I don't think just giving suburban alternatives is going to keep it affordable anymore. And in fact, I think looking at ways to avoid displacement, make sure people are whole, it's harder than ever because the demand is there, and it seems like no matter what you do, you can build more, you can do whatever, but it's people are suffering. And well, what is the answer here? And I mean, very broadly, I think we need sort of radical solutions, something on the order of actual redistribution of city wealth. Anything less is just not going to be strong enough. Just some thoughts. As I was saying, the suburban frontier has been the story of the 20th century. We had affordability largely because we had new technology in the form of first streetcars and then automobiles, and that definitely helped for a long while. The progressive era, really was hand in hand with this whole project, which was an anti-urban, anti-chaos. There's books about the search for order, and the search for order. Wouldn't you know, it had to do a lot with separating the races, and essentially kind of having an atomized, separate existence, and just wanting to wipe away the chaos of the urban area. I don't think that's tenable. I think chaos is going to exist, and we have to learn to deal with it and embrace it, instead of just bulldozing it and trying to place people out in further little curated, perfectly planned communities. The big question in the progressive era mind too is just tenants is seen as being unseemly, as being less than a fully dignified, realized person. They when they talk about the mindset of the hilltop folks, they saw the slum dwellers as an active menace. If they move to your community and build an apartment in your community, they will bring the failure of the human spirit to your community. And there are better ways. I think if we're seeing this kind of classic idea that tenants are that's not a real way of existing. It's temporarily embarrassed homeowners. This allows us, as we're seeing, the huge profits made in landlording, in general, like, they're being milked, and it is seen as being a landlord. Oh, that's an actual, that's a productive member of society, and it is in our interest to see them thrive, especially the mom and pops. In places like Germany, as we've seen, are seeing less, affordability issues. A big part of that is the fact that being a middle-aged young person or old person and being a renter is seen as legitimate. Especially in several key cities, Berlin, 85% renters, they have strong tenant protections. It is seen as stable. It is seen as dignified. And you can, much more autonomous too. You can control your space. And honestly, if we're seeing any movement to make anything more affordable, the classic growth machine of realtors, highway engineers, and the growing suburbs, it's not going to work anymore. And I think we have to have a much more tenant-led movement. And I believe if there's any hope, essentially trying to share the wealth of our cities, as led by the landless, that's our only hope. So that's the very broad strokes.
I could probably take the next hour in making some comments to the three presentations we've heard. In terms of the economics that Josh has provided to us, I think it's real interesting to note the importance of the explosion in the mortgage-backed security market that he mentioned. When I was first a loan officer and then managed the mortgage department for a commercial bank, we were largely a portfolio lender. There was a small amount of involvement with the investment community where we sold mortgage loans, packaged them and sold them to pension funds and some other institutional investors. But the MBS market really took off, I guess, in the late 1980s and really exploded. And one of the things that made the MBS market viable was standardization of the loan documents and of the terms of loans that were being made. And this was basically orchestrated in the United States by the main GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And so that's really, in my view, what really caused the market to explode. However, and Josh really didn't get into this, Wall Street saw this as an impediment to their ability to generate volume. And so they created the private label mortgage-backed securities market. And that's when subprime mortgage loans, in my view, started to come into play. And the problem with the subprime mortgage loans was that they were not underwritten to conventional standards. And in fact, a significant percentage of that business was originated by fraud and misrepresentation. And Wall Street managed to get the main bond rating agencies to rate the securities that they generated as low risk, as AAA rated bonds. None of that was accurate. And we paid a heck of a price for allowing that kind of business to take place. And in fact, in my view, it brought down Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac after the 2008 crash. So Mark, Josh, you might want to comment on that later, just as one initial comment. There's another economic issue that you might want to respond to, and that is that economists have argued in places like New York City, Angela, you might appreciate this, that the low rate of home ownership actually is a benefit because it adds to labor mobility. In other words, when the economy begins to go south, the individuals who are renters have an easier time getting out of their leases and moving to where the job opportunities are now being created. That's that's something to consider and maybe can be commented on. Angela, I think the real benefit of what your work is doing is adding transparency, so that the public sector is providing information that has been previously hidden, and therefore enables people like you and those of us who've always been interested in fair lending and in equality of access to housing can really deal with the issues that are created by the corporatization of the real estate investment market. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about transparency if you can. And Mark, the first thing is that several people have asked that you clarify what you meant when you said horrible people. I think I know what you meant, but I think a lot of people might need to know what you mean by that, so we have a clear understanding of who you're talking about. The other thing that comes up in my mind listening to you was the fact that if we look throughout history of immigration in the United States, one of the objectives of immigrants was to acquire a property in which they themselves and their family members could live in. And so you have a desire to particularly acquire 2 to 4 family properties so that one unit could be occupied by the owner and the other 3 units could be occupied by tenants, most often family members. At least that's been the case in the cities of the United States, where immigration has been a continuous pattern. And I think it continues today pretty strongly, although the opportunity for immigrants to acquire a 2, 3, or 4 unit property is most difficult. I can say this, in my experience as a lender, it was amazing to me how many people would come in who were maybe second generation US residents, maybe not even citizens yet, and have accumulated the sufficient savings to put down a 20% down payment or more. Often banks require for a 2 to 4 unit property a minimum down payment of 25% cash down payment, but people were able to come in with those kinds of cash down payments in order to acquire these properties. And I think that that's probably still a pattern in many cities. So Angela, maybe you have some information on that in New York City. So with that, I will turn it over to each of you, the 3 of you, to respond to those issues I brought up and ask questions of one another. And I'll join in as seems appropriate. So anyone care to start?
I can make my response quick, just to break the pause. Horrible people. I think in general, I'm being a bit glib, but honestly, I think what's notable, Cincinnati, of course, back in the Civil War was, a free state. Kentucky was a slave state. It's not surprising if you go south, you'll see Confederate flags. In Cincinnati, growing up, if you go north to any suburb far enough, you will eventually see Confederate flags on all sides. I think, that alone always, gave me this just feeling of dread in every direction. I think you could talk about the human spirit and, the aesthetics of McMansions, strip malls, big box stores, etc. And I think certainly there is something bad about car-based, suburbia, especially the further out it is. If it's a streetcar suburb, I think that's, pretty decent. Those are the places that already existed by 1910. When you talk about Westchester, Ohio, or places that are, lush suburbs like the city of the village of Indian Hill, which looks like something you'd see, full of crunchy, suburbia in California. But this is, it's a right-wing stronghold. The suburbs in many places are still full of, I think, right-wing sentiment. I think if you look at the seat of fascism in America, you could look at kind of the decentralized, kind of suburban blobs of Florida. You can look at, I think, Long Island. Long Island, the further out you go, is some pretty nasty stuff out there. But I think, too, just, I think in practical terms, if you want to reform the system, people who have bought in through the realtor, kind of growth machine, they have a very strong incentive to not fix this. If they see if they see the fact that they are only 45 minutes out in this, lush McMansion area, if that is infringed upon or, endangered through reforms, they're gonna be your biggest enemy for the rights of tenants, the rights of justice and access to land, etc. So that's my brief answer.
Okay. Any thoughts in response, Angela or Josh?
I'm happy to tackle the 2 points you addressed towards me, Ed. So yeah, I hear what you're saying on the subprime mortgage market. I'm sure there was lots of fraudulent behavior. I know there was, because I have read some of the research on it. And so yeah, I think you're right that's the subprime crisis was in part the result of heavy lobbying by certain vested interests in the financial sector, influencing the regulators and influencing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I don't think that sort of necessarily detracts from the broader argument that liberalizing the financial sector inevitably leads to an over investment of credit going into housing, which drives up house prices, especially when you couple that with a sort of wider macro financial regime and fiscal regime, which is oriented around supporting home ownership above and beyond other tenures. I think those dynamics would have still happened with or without the subprime crisis and the GFC. They might have just been, that build up of house prices in that credit bubble would have been slower, especially in the US. But some other crisis would have happened eventually. You just had too much mortgage debt relative to incomes, and somewhere would have blown up and catalyzed a wider crisis. On your second point around New York's city and the low rate of home ownership being a benefit, yeah, that's an interesting one. I have sympathy with the broad macroeconomic argument that that home ownership is not the most economically efficient tenure form. I think basically that's true, and I do think it discouraged a sort of regime of where home ownership is the dominant policy preference, discourages labor mobility and probably reduces productivity for that reason. In the UK, we have very high what's called stamp duty, which is simply transaction taxes. So when you buy a house, you pay like 3 to 5% of the property of the value of the property, and this, of course, massively discourages people to move house. And so it's a very inefficient tax compared to, say, an annual tax on the increase in the value of the property or the land underneath it, which I think is a much more efficient way of taxing property. But more generally, yeah, I have sympathy with that. But I think your argument was that certain build to rent construction agencies and developers were making this argument, right? And that was sort of giving them some cover for this sort of quite speculative forms of, as Angela was saying, corporatization of the New York housing system. So yeah, I'm sure that they were using that argument in a slightly undesirable way, but maybe Angela can comment on that a bit further.
I'll give Angela the floor in just a second. I just want to, my thought was that the stamp duty that you referred to in the UK might have the same impact that Proposition 13 had in California in terms of being a disincentive for people to sell their property, given the benefits they experience under Prop 13. And is that basically your point with regard to the stamp duty?
Yeah, I think any tax system that discourages mobility is highly problematic when it comes to housing. And yeah, I think the Prop 13, I think I've written about that in Why Can't You Afford a Home? It's just encouraging rent extraction as opposed to, you know, using housing as a consumption good and a place to live and work. Basically, that's what we need to return to, a system where that's the type of usage that we go for. Thanks.
Angela, what are your thoughts on what you've heard so far from our other two panelists and from me as well?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I was thinking often actually about your question about the data transparency question. I guess like data transparency is a key tool for empowerment more broadly. So like we're somewhat lucky in New York City in terms of the availability of public source data. You know, there are a lot of places across the country that are trying to replicate, for example, who owns what, to kind of get at what kind of like understand more about like who actually owns your building, how many properties they own, and are kind of bearing up against the lack of transparent data generally. Obviously, there is a lot of you know, discussion could be had about like how that data is maintained, how often it's updated, you know, that sort of thing too, like which agencies are, you know, in charge of it, who has access to certain types of data, who has agreements for data that isn't just publicly available to everyone. But that is something that I guess in New York City, we are a little bit lucky to have. You know, oftentimes when certain legislation is being debated, they will ask us about the numbers. You know, if, you know, we exempted this type of landlord with this amount of units, like how many people would that be? And it kind of is illuminating to think that like a lot of these policy recommendations are being made without any sense of what that number is, kind of like arbitrary, in fact. But you know, they're not really understanding fully the scope or impact of what those kind of changes could bring. But additionally, data transparency is like a key aspect of empowering tenants themselves for collective action. So like knowing complaint and violation histories, knowing the number of buildings your landlord owns, being aware of changes in rent stabilization status across your building, or the number of evictions that are currently happening in your building. And also like kind of creating these inroads of where other tenants can connect for collective actions, like rent strikes, like 311 calling campaigns, like packing the courts when their neighbors are at risk of eviction. These are kind of like all the sort of like both individual and like larger scale, like macro sort of like level that data transparency can really bring, and it really activate tenants for collective actions and also kind of like inform policy in a much better way. If you could remind me of the other question that you had concerning like the why it's good that tenants are not, or like that there isn't a high rate of homeownership in New York City.
Well, that was a question I posed to Josh generally, that economists argue that cities with a low rate of home ownership benefit in the sense that when we go through economic cycles, when we hit a downturn in economic cycles and employment increases, people who are tenants, when there's a high demand for rental units, have an easier time getting out of their lease and being able to move wherever the job opportunities exist. So Josh commented that economists do sort of sympathize with that argument. Whereas in my own case, my last 20 years at Fannie Mae before I retired, our mission was to increase the rate of home ownership among low-income households and minorities in particular. So even in New York City, we were constantly working to try to find ways to make housing more affordable for those segments of the population who had been underserved, what we called underserved.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to think about the way in which, like, I guess I don't really have much to say on the actual like nitty gritty economics part of it, but in terms of like the actual lived experience of tenants, I would say that like it's interesting to think of New York City as a city of like transients. Like so many people move here for jobs for whatever reason, but so many people who are like, if we're looking at the actual data of New Yorkers that are, you know, in shelters today or that are being like pushed out of New York generally, like we're seeing sort of the like reverse Great Migration, where people who came to the North, Black families that came to the North for jobs, are now moving back to whatever family they have in the South, and a lot of the times too in New York, like they are being pushed to, Yonkers, to some towns that border Jamaica and Cambria Heights and things like that on Long Island. So, the people that are bearing the number of people that are living in shelters, the people that are bearing the brunt of that are people who are, more of the native New Yorkers and less so, I think, people that are able to kind of exercise that flexibility or that sort of like take advantage of that are definitely people who are of a certain means, just in terms of like being able to kind of live and move depending on kind of markets where it's like, for low income renters, that's not really the case, especially if they have like a housing voucher. And although we have like very robust protections in terms of source of income discrimination being against the law, like, landlords cannot refuse to rent to you if you do have a subsidy. It's rampant. It's a ubiquitous part of renting here in the city. And enforcement is really down because of just how the city's budget is allocated. There's not a lot of resources that are going towards the City Commission on Human Rights, and like their offices have been gutted in many senses. So yeah, I don't know if that actually answers your question, but that kind of what comes to mind of like who actually can exercise that is probably not the most marginalized folks. And so many, homeowners that I think, some of the saddest cases that we had in Queens, but that were sadly very, common, were the like deed theft cases, or cases where like, a Black family that owned a home since the 1950s, 1960s were not even aware that their house was in foreclosure until they were brought with a holdover proceeding. And at that point, it's too late. There's nothing that can be done. And in terms of like actually having, any sort of, generational wealth through housing, like was eliminated for that family, and like how devastating that is. So I guess that's kind of a rant and not exactly what you were asking me, but just I'm thinking about the actual tenants that would be able to exercise that is like a very specific subset.
Certainly, from what all three of you have contributed, we know that the issues of why land prices go up is a big part of this in terms of the economic dynamics, and how the rising land prices run through the rest of the economy, first through the property markets. And then, of course, as property costs increase, you have the labor force trying to negotiate increases in income in order to cover the inflation in their cost of living for housing. And it translates all the way through the economy. I think, Josh, you would accept that analysis, would you not? So from your perspective, what's the problem? And in your own perspective, what do you think can be done about it, given the constraints that you have as a public official and with the political environment generally?
Yeah. First of all, let me say thank you for inviting me and for accommodating my my schedule. It's good to be with you, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to just join this panel from the beginning. I will try to come back and actually conclude in some ways with talking about some answers to David's question and the role of community land trusts and things like New York City's great Mitchell-Lama program, which I think are models of social housing that actually get at some of what he's addressing. I'll start with the caveat, I'm an elected official, a politician, and we sort of deal in what works, both politically, what could you actually do, and then from a policy point of view, what would make things better. And sometimes that can distance you from very good, more theoretical or analytic thinking. That said, I really am enjoying this sort of, Georgist moment, maybe. And my sense is on the call, you've got some like traditional Georgists, some YIMBY Georgists, and some Marxist Georgists. And I'm enjoying kind of watching that, even if it's not the place I'm mostly steeped. I've spent my whole career thinking about, quote unquote, the housing problem in New York City. But even just in my lifetime, it has really shifted what that has meant. I started working in housing in New York City in the early 1990s, when in many ways, a lot of neighborhoods were still grappling with the overhang of the abandonment crisis. You still had quite a lot of abandoned city housing. So there really was, for many people, an affordability challenge, but for many other people, a conditions challenge, living in housing in neighborhoods with so much abandoned housing, and just an inability to live in non-lead contaminated, basically safe neighborhoods, and how to think about that. As I started my career working at the Fifth Avenue Committee, we were really on the sort of front edge of gentrification. So not yet in many ways a broader affordability crisis where the large numbers of middle class and certainly working class families could not find an affordable place to live, but something a little more targeted. Tenants, working class folks in neighborhoods that were being gentrified, being pushed out of neighborhoods that they had lived in, and all kinds of new development, bringing attention to those neighborhoods. So a kind of more specific gentrification crisis after an abandonment crisis. And now I think we really do have a much broader affordability challenge where it's not just specific neighborhoods, but across the marketplace, and not just genuinely like low-income families who can't afford housing, but a very broad swath of working class and middle class New Yorkers. So even defining the housing problem, is a bit of a challenge. And of course, if you look back at New York City more historically, you see that as well, right? New York City begins working locally on what should municipal housing policy be in the settlement house era, really, and kind of in the latter half of the 19th century. With the first set of tenement reforms coming in 1879 and then strengthening them in 1901, when people were really looking at conditions, were horrified by the conditions people were living in, and trying to think about how you set regulatory standards that require just the basics for folks. But after decades of that, there was clarity that, okay, it's good that the old law and new law set some basic market standards, but you still have so many people who can't find basic, decent, affordable, adequate housing. And so New York City is on the leading edge in this country of a government role in providing housing. I think a lot of folks on this call know that New York City stepped up and started engaging in public housing development before the federal government. First houses on the Lower East Side were actually a New York City and philanthropic initiative before the federal government gets involved. Lots of that between the 1930s and the 1970s. I'll come back in a minute to New York City's kind of a couple of things New York City did in particular, like that Mitchell-Lama program that I think we need to come back to today. But obviously, since the 1970s, the government's role in directly producing housing was undermined and badly constrained by neoliberal policies since then. And while New York City has continued to provide public sector capital for affordable housing, we have not strengthened the kind of public option role of expanding the footprint of housing outside the speculative marketplace. And what we've mostly done is created incentives for profit private developers to build housing, much of it market rate and some of it affordable. And that creates a whole series of challenges. You have to battle them for what the affordability will really be. You have to fight to make sure it isn't taken out of affordability at the back end of the system. And especially if you're doing it through public subsidies and tax breaks offered to for-profit private developers, you worry that it's simply going to get capitalized into the value of the land, something I know a lot of you on the call have given a lot of worries to. One of the things for me in particular is I've spent like the last 20 years kind of fighting the white whale of this big tax break called 421A, a tax exemption essentially for-profit private developers to build originally multifamily housing with no affordability requirements, and then adding in some affordability requirements over time. And on the one hand, if you ask a developer, they'll tell you now without that tax break, which the legislature allowed to expire last year, they can't build anything at all. But I think if you do kind of an analysis of really what has happened over time, however much of a tax break you would give would just get capitalized into the land prices. So it's a little bit of a never-ending cycle. Let me say a few things about just what I think New York City ought to be doing at the moment. Oh, I guess one more thing before I just jump in and give a couple observations about what I think the important next steps in New York City housing policy are, and then glad to go back and take some questions and engage with some of the other folks on the panel if they're still there. One thing that I do think is really important, and that I think is challenging to figure out how to knit with a Georgist perspective, is the attention on land use policies and its intersections with our housing policies. And I'll say just a few things here. One is obviously like what New York City's whole special sauce is the density and the diversity that we have. And we are lucky in New York City. Like what drives our creativity, what drives reasons people want to live here, what drives the whole raison d'etre of our city is to be a place where lots of people live and can live, and to try to make it as diverse by income and in every other way as possible. That's part of what's so worrisome about the affordability crisis driving out working class and low income people. And, you know, all the stories about Black families who have been in an exodus from the city. Obviously, the history of African Americans in their contributions to New York City's history, culture, business, economy, creativity, so central. But we got to be thinking about that, right? We want fair taxation. We want, you know, fairness, but I think we also want to promote the kind of density and diversity that our city's been lucky to have. That is not easy to figure out how to do in a capitalist economy where if you drive value up, it's really hard to keep individuals of very diverse incomes living near each other. That's not what American real estate policy mostly does. I don't even know that it's a goal of most places, but it really is not just a goal for New York City, but it's kind of like existential raison d'etre, and we need to be paying attention to it. And therefore, I do think fair housing policies, yes, absolutely. Tenant protections, rent stabilization, good cause eviction, things that enable people to continue to live in a place as values rise around them, 100% critical. Policies that actively promote, that confront histories of exclusion and promote inclusivity really matter. And they're not so easy to do. So, so let me just say a couple of things about, you know, what I think we ought to be focused on moving forward, and then glad to take some questions or engage in some dialogue. So, you know, I mentioned that 421A tax break that was the primary thing that for-profit developers have been using for decades. It expired last year, and there is a big debate about what we should do going forward. You know, my point of view on this is what we should do is have comprehensive property tax reform, because New York City's property tax system is so wildly skewed to homeowners over renters, but also in just a weird set of quirky ways that wind up taxing outer borough homeowners, especially Black and brown outer borough homeowners, with a much higher effective tax rate than me and other upper middle class white folk in attractive neighborhoods in Brownstone, Brooklyn, and Western Queens and Manhattan. So we ought to have a comprehensive property tax reform. Bringing Georgia's principles into it would be super interesting to say, let's look at land value taxation. Let's incentivize affordability and multifamily development. But right now, we don't even have just basic fairness, right? Like a simple flat property tax where everybody paid 1%, let's say, of the value of either their land or their buildings would be dramatically fairer than the thing we currently have. So we ought to fight for it. I'm fighting for it. I'm maybe a lonely voice on it, but I am not stopping. So that's number one. Like, we need an approach to property tax reform. I'll give just one second idea on 421A. Well, two ideas more on 421A. One, because we don't underwrite that tax break, like on the one hand, it's a housing subsidy, and most of our housing subsidies, somebody underwrites and says, given the cost of what you're building and given the affordability that you're promising, that is the public benefit, we're going to evaluate what tax break you should get. But 421A doesn't do that. It just gives it to everyone. And so, of course, it gets capitalized into the land and winds up just going to speculative owners and sellers in a much higher volume that anyone should be comfortable with. So simply a process of adding a layer of underwriting, are you paying a reasonable price? Obviously, big question about what that is, but, and then given the costs and given the affordability commitments, what mix of tax break and subsidies are you eligible for would promote a much better system than we have. And we really could do that. We absolutely need to strengthen our tenant protections for all the reasons that have been said here. Even if you believe what we need is a lot more supply, actually adding enough supply to make a difference would take years. And if you're not willing to protect low-income families in New York City from eviction and displacement into homelessness with some basic tenant protections like good cause eviction, hard for me to believe that what you actually care about is people's decent, adequate right to housing. And to me, that basic trade of pro-supply policies for stronger tenant protections and good cause eviction is such an obvious deal that Albany should have made in this past session and needs to make now. And anybody who just, can't say both of those things, I get very frustrated with. And then finally, I'll stop here. And then I see a bunch of other questions in the chat that I'm happy to answer. But I really do want to focus on the need to expand the footprint, whatever you prefer to call it, social housing, housing outside the speculative marketplace, Mitchell-Lama housing. I think, I don't know, I actually was reading this interesting new book called The Public Option. This actually doesn't focus on housing almost at all. It's looking much more at healthcare and higher ed. But the value of having, I think in New York City right now, if you add it all up, if you include public housing, if you include Mitchell-Lama co-ops, if you include nonprofit affordable and supportive housing, you get about 10% of New York City's housing units that are owned outside of for-profit private ownership. The difference it would make if we could say double that to 20%. We still have a very mixed market. There'd still be a lot of incentives for the building of multifamily housing. You'd still have a whole lot of housing options and types. But I think you would do something very useful in the marketplace, expand the set of people who benefited from it. And one big element of that, and I'll just end here, is to me, I think the most successful housing policy we've had in New York City are Mitchell-Lama cooperatives. That was the state and the city teaming up to take big swaths of land like Amalgamated Houses in Co-op City and Penn South, and build multifamily cooperative homeownership with pretty significant restrictions on resale. I might allow actually a little more appreciation than the classic Mitchell-Lama did, which really allows almost no appreciation at all, maybe a modest appreciation. But we ran this natural experiment where we built about 150,000 Mitchell-Lama units, half rentals, half co-ops, and over half of the rentals have been pulled out of their affordability restriction. Over 90% of the Mitchell-Lama co-ops remain affordable cooperatives today, decades and decades later, despite the incentive of those owners to go private because they would benefit, even though their kids or their neighbors might suffer. And it is just a policy that we should revive today. And you could do that through community land trusts. You could do that through another round of limited equity co-ops like Mitchell-Lama's, that model of a ground lease and some ground rent while enabling tenants to have some share of the ownership and decision-making and appreciation. It's the only way I see that working and middle-class families will have access to something like home ownership in New York City going forward. So if we want any working or middle-class families to really see that possibility. And I finally think it's one of the only ways to persuade New Yorkers that density is actually good for them, as long as the idea of density is kind of in the hands of developers. I just think people will be suspicious of it. And so if you think we need more supply, tethering it to something like a new round of affordable multifamily cooperatives has a lot better chance of building a durable political coalition, as well as creating something the market is missing. I'm going to stop there, and I'm glad to have whatever mix of dialogue or questions we have time for.
Brad, thank you so much. It's clear from your comments that the discussion of housing policy and the housing situation in New York City is getting a lot of time and attention on the part of at least your office and other public officials. Before we bring Angela, I'm sure Angela has a number of important questions and comments for you, and Mark Mollineaux in as well. I have a couple of things that I'd just like to put to you. One is, it seems to me, you didn't specifically mention the assessment situation in New York City. As a reference point, a colleague of mine was the chief assessor in Greenwich, Connecticut. And he told us that keeping assessments current was extremely important. And in fact, that the land assessment constituted 70% of the total valuation in Greenwich, Connecticut. I would imagine that New York City's land portion of the total assessments would be somewhat similar, considering the fact that the value of a building is depreciation, is the replacement cost less depreciation. I don't know how accurate New York City's assessments are, but maybe you can shed a light on that particular question, and then we'll let Angela and Mark go at you.
Yeah, this is a big issue. And when I said basically we have a cockamamie system that is in dramatic need of updating, assessments are absolutely a part of that. But the whole system is so warped that the assessment process is only a little bit of it. And I'll actually give, one example here. So what I'm pretty sure, the data says is the largest driver of inequity. Like if you look at the reason why the effective tax rate on my row house in Park Slope is a third or a quarter as an effective tax rate, as that in the Northeast Bronx or Southeast Queens, like largely African-American, much less high property value neighborhoods. The driver was actually something they did to be kind of thoughtful, which was to say, we're going to put an assessment cap, an annual increase cap, and basically say, we're going to hold down your assessment to no more than 5% a year. And in some ways, of course, that was like a lovely impulse to say, I'm sure in a neighborhood where property values are spiking, you have seniors on fixed income, and we don't want to drive them out of their homes. And so we'll place this 5% cap on as a way of preventing people who are house rich but cash poor or income constrained. But you do that for decades and decades, and then neighborhoods like Park Slope, where I live, but many others in the city, have had their entire values repressed, and their effective tax rates in those neighborhoods are much lower than elsewhere. So yes, I mean, but that's an example of like, that's not a problem that the assessors didn't do a good job of like keeping up with my house. That was that we put in this system of caps that warped the system over time. And then we also have this problem of that we look at co-ops like rentals rather than like 1 to 4 co-ops and condos. We evaluate their, like rentals rather than like 1 to 4 family homes. We do a sort of income-based valuation effort. And so everything is just really warped. One example of that is that if you've got a piece of ground today and you're going to decide whether to build condos or to build rentals on it, you'll pay a third more in taxes for the rental building than you will for the condo building. So our tax policy is an inhibitor of the building of rental housing. So anyway, that's a long answer to like, yes, both our assessment policies and the structure of property taxation really needs comprehensive reform. It'd be an intriguing idea to focus on land value as part of that rather than exclusively looking at sort of improvements value or total value, but just having a basically fair, coherent system that tried to say, what is the market value of that property? And having a flat percentage tax rate would be way fairer and less irrational than the one we currently have.
And you've pointed out the law of unforeseen consequences with regard to circuit breakers. that they have to be thought through very thoroughly. Angela, would you like to ask your comptroller any questions or comment on his presentation?
Thank you so much for being here. It was an amazing presentation. I guess one of the questions that I have in terms of the 421A, what do you like, how would you respond to the people that I feel like that has been something that within the last month, I've seen a few opinion pieces kind of going around that there needs to be consideration of some sort of replacement to that program. I guess I'm just curious to get like how you would respond to that.
Yeah. Two things. There's two different arguments people are making. Honestly, well, three arguments I'm making, two of which I'm sympathetic to and one of which I'm really not. The one that I'm not is just like it's come to stand for a kind of developer YIMBYism. Like we just want to be able to build, and anything that keeps us from doing it the ways we want to do it is NIMBYism and should be blamed for the housing crisis. And there's a surprising amount of, maybe not a surprising amount of that, but that's kind of most of what is I hear in the debate. The two things I'm more sympathetic to are, one, there was a deadline last year and you were supposed to be able to kind of get in and file under that program. And now, for a range of reasons, mostly having to do with skyrocketing interest rates, hard for people to complete their projects within that deadline, and some reasonable extension for some of those problems should exist. And I actually think that's totally reasonable. I did a lot of work to help achieve the rezoning of the area around the Gowanus Canal to entitle the building of 8,000 new units of housing, 3,000 of them affordable. Bunch of those developers have compelling projects to me that I think are good. And that they're going to have a hard time completing on time. And some deadline flexibility for projects like that, I think, makes sense and is worth figuring out how to do. In terms of what new program we should have, here are my quick ideas, because the old program was just a boondoggle. It was like $1.8 billion a year for very, very, very little affordability. Increasingly, what it was for was outer borough developments. Every single unit, the market rate unit and the affordable units, well above the price of the vast majority of existing units in the neighborhood, and with the affordable units set to only be affordable, quote unquote, to the 25% wealthiest New Yorkers. So just to me, like, that program was worth ending. What I would like to see is, one, eliminate that gap I mentioned between rentals and condos on new development. We should not be providing an incentive for condos over rentals for new development. So equalize condo and rental tax rates for forward-going development. I'd rather see comprehensive property tax reform, but if I can't have that, at least equalize rental and condo taxation going forward, which would reduce the tax rate on new rental property by about a third, if that was the way you did it, and help make it more possible to build multifamily rental housing at market rate with no subsidies in New York City. Second, for things in high value neighborhoods in Manhattan, in Brownstone, Brooklyn, and other places like that, where the mandatory inclusionary housing model that 75% market, 25% affordable exists, rather than try to say that all gets 421A exemptions, submit it to underwriting by the city's housing department. And if you can show you're building something, the reasonable costs of which compared to the affordability commitments you're making requires a tax break, then I'm open to giving it to you. But by underwriting it, you help prevent it all being capitalized into sale price, and you help address the problem that when you set a system up like that, you have to give as much subsidy as is needed for the subsidy neediest project to every single developer. And so you pump in way more subsidy than's needed. Underwrite the deals and give the tax break that's needed for the cost versus the affordability of the project. That's, of course, how you would approach almost any subsidy. And we could do it here. And then I don't mind doing it if that's what's necessary to get the affordability. And then third, for the outer borough neighborhoods where they had this program that I call the 130% of area median income program, which is to say the affordable units were not affordable to anyone below about the top 25% of New Yorkers. Let's replace that with a new version of the Mitchell-Lama program. Let's say what we'd like to see in the outer boroughs is that model of multifamily affordable co-ops. A lot to say about what that really should look like. What income level? Is it a land trust model? But I'd be really happy to give a tax break to developers to build a new generation of Mitchell-Lama co-ops in New York City. I think people would accept a density bonus to achieve that. So you could probably get density bonus on those sites. I'm open to some additional subsidies to make it happen. Private builders are the ones who built those Mitchell-Lamas in the first place, even though they then got removed from the speculative marketplace. So there's room for people to make money assembling, developing, and building those sites. But that goes back to this idea of increasing the footprint of social housing in New York City.
Hey, Mark, you have a question or comment for Brad?
Yeah, I think in general, I definitely think this is the attitude we need everywhere, which is just an all the above. To have affordable housing, unfortunately, we just need increasingly kind of complex instruments. And I definitely agree with the looking towards co-ops, land trusts that build a lot. One thing I'm disappointed, the land trusts we have don't really have the same kind of growth trajectory we want. I guess the question I have is 421A. I think, you know, I've learned a little bit from afar. I did an episode recently, but it's complicated. But I get the general idea, which is certainly based upon the tax and equity, you need to rebalance that to get any rental built. And I guess the very, very broadly, I'm kind of curious about, you know, are there more elegant ways to push development towards rentals if you take as a given? I don't know offhand. This is kind of a broader question. Like in Vancouver, as far as I know, they build 99% condos, almost no rentals. What policy made that happen? And, you know, how can we counteract that? Because I do fear that, you know, every renter deserves, you know, basic protections, and that just, you know, that's just true. But if you do that and then have condos be more self-sufficient, the you know, if you don't do anything else, it's just going to be all condos for new builds. Yep. And I wonder, like, if you were more blue skying it, what is the best way to do it? If 421A is obviously a bit of a hack.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm open to other people's ideas, you know, who have thinking a little more blue sky context rather than just like the politics of the moment that we have. But I'll say a couple of quick things. First, I really like your first point about capacity in the social housing sector. Like the difference between American land trusts and European social housing corporations is like the difference between, like, I don't know, like a mom and pop, you know, anyway. So yes, we need to take that seriously and not just hand wave at it. If we want to have a new generation of social housing, we're going to need something like the social housing entities in Europe that produce it. And whether your model of that is something more like a social housing development authority, or whether your model of that is something like, anyway, that's a critical point. And we shouldn't. You can't hand wave at it. Like, you got to build that capacity and not just say, I like to have it, and then hope magically capacity to actually build it emerges. On your second point, like, I just have been so surprised in the uptake of the proposal that we made on 421A, because here I am, this, like, you know, left wing, you know, long-time affordable housing guy saying the first thing I'd like to do is reduce tax rates on forward-going multifamily rental housing by a third. And rather than developers saying, wow, that's great, the controller is saying that, they're like, we just want back what we had before, and no, we don't even want to talk about this idea. So I feel puzzled by that, because I know it won't be enough on its own to get deep affordability, but I just would have thought people would have said, great, thank you, we'll take that. Now what do you want? What do we do next? And I have barely been able to get that out in the conversation. So I'm really trying hard to push that and saying, before you figure out what you layer on as an affordability break, and before you try to solve all of the problems with existing valuation, which are many, let's at least just solve that. But we could really do that. Like, the legislature could solve that problem. And that wouldn't solve the problem of rental housing development, but obviously reducing rental tax rates by a third would do something in the marketplace, and having them equal to condos. I think your question beyond that, if you could really blue sky it, is a good one. I'd be curious to hear what other ideas people have.
Well, thank you, Brad, and thank you for that question, Mark. So I thank all of you for your participation. I thank our panelists for providing us with tremendous insight into what is causing this housing crisis and how we are rationally trying to respond to it, both in terms of the theory and in terms of practical day-to-day activity. So I will thank you all for your participation.